Thank you to our Deputy Chairperson, Wali Musa, and my greetings to all the commissioners who are present today and to the cabinet colleagues and the officials at this, I think, quite important session. And I want to start by appreciating the opportunity just for some reflections. So I think today it's really what you call the lie of the land, maybe a little bit of an ambitious scope, but I'd like to share a few observations on the nexus between climate change objectives and industrial policy, and then focus on some aspects of the how of our response. In other words, the implementation part. So really to appreciate that the Commission is beginning to think about the economic aspect of climate change, that the argument is no longer an argument about the science of climate change and the necessity of it, but it's really a discussion about how societies manage these in the most equitable and smart way. So from our work, it's clear to us that climate change will impact on industrial development in a number of ways. And I'm going to identify 5 of them that we're grappling with. The first one is that there will be new industrial opportunities that emerge as a result of society's response to climate change. New products and services, but also new ways of producing traditional products. And to unlock this, to get a slice of the opportunities for South Africa, we will need to develop many things. We'll need to sharpen our R&D capacity, but also the ability for fast adaptability to seize opportunities. It's not always those who invent new technologies, but it's often those who are most nimble in utilizing it, in customizing it, and in bringing it to market. And this means that our suite of public support ranging from state procurement to industrial and research incentives to taxes and trade tariff structures, together of course with private sector investment and know-how, must be harnessed in combination, and that's the key, in combination to promote a green industrialization agenda. We are already taking on a number of new industrial opportunities, and I'll talk about that a bit later. The second observation is that climate change responses will add additional costs to existing businesses to convert to either the new technologies of production or to to adopt a lower and greener energy consumption. And of course, in a number of cases, to develop new products that respond to the needs of society in this period. It is, of course, true that the economic cost of doing nothing is very, very substantial and is clearly much higher than the cost of taking action. But at the same time, we must recognize the specific cost-raising effects of our mitigation and our adaptation strategies on sectors and firms. And of course, I want to say right up front, the fact that there will be costs is not an argument against change, but a recognition that these costs must be factored in and mitigated. Clumsy policy interventions globally or locally that are well meant, but are not costed and carefully mitigated must be avoided. The third observation is that climate change policies will affect access to international markets for our goods and services. And we are likely to see trade pressures from other countries in the form of border taxes based on carbon emission content of goods and services. This is very, very important for South Africa. About a quarter of our GDP is generated by exports. And accordingly, it is important that we recognize the important or the critical trade component of climate change. The very pressures may also provide a rationale for greater resort to localization in order to reduce transport carbon footprints. And this can impact on us in a number of ways. On the one hand, it can boost local production for goods for the South African economy. So instead of each suit that we wear adding to the carbon footprint through the enormous cost of transporting it from far-flung places in the world, it may get societies to look more at local production. At the same time, it may also limit access to export markets. And exports, as I've indicated, are quite important. Some producers elsewhere in the world are likely to seek to turn climate change consideration into locational advantage. It's not only something that South Africa may do, it may be something that everybody looks at and say, how can they ensure that the opportunity that comes from this period is addressed. The fourth area to perhaps share with you is one value that you've raised, and that is access to capital markets, to banking and finance services, as well as investments, will increasingly be based on climate change considerations. Large institutional fund investors, as well as international financial institutions, are likely to be leading on this. We already see the World Bank has a number of policies in place for access to its funds. And shareholder and activist pressure can be expected to increase sharply in future. I think what COVID has done, together with the compelling signs on climate change, is tell us that we live in a world that is fragile and that we need to build resilience. And obviously adaptation to climate change is an important part of that resilience. One aspect of this is that the danger of large corporations slicing off high carbon emitting businesses and selling these to black industrialists under the broad frame of transformation may result in stranded assets in the hands of new black industrialists in future. So this is something that one has to recognize, consider as a society, and think through how best to deal with. Another aspect is that while competitiveness has, in the old paradigm, been based on cost, if other considerations like quality and availability are equal, it will increasingly be based in future on carbon emission. This may then influence expectation of returns by investors, creating challenges for businesses that have not adapted timeously. So to date, the bottom line of financial returns may increasingly include a carbon positive return expectation from investors. The fifth and final observation is that energy policies and energy sources are critical. I mean, it's I guess, absolutely self-evident. In the longer term, based on our current knowledge, green hydrogen as a source of energy seems to be optimal for societies, and it has particular advantages for South Africa. If the 20th century becomes known as the century of crude oil and nuclear energy, the 21st century may well be known as the century of renewable energy and hydrogen, green hydrogen. The hydrogen economy is not just, of course, something important for South Africa, but for the world at large. It could provide a just transition with the potential to decarbonize various industry value chains and provide security of energy supply. There's a growing international interest, commissioners, on this, and you would have seen a greater momentum in green energy for the production of clean energy. This is a key factor in addressing the daunting decarbonization challenges and transforming high-emitting industries, and I'll talk to some of those industries in a moment, towards cleaner production. And hydrogen is potentially the missing piece in the puzzle towards attaining net zero emissions by 2050, in line with the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And South Africa is well positioned to capitalize on this as the platinum group metals is such an important feedstock in green hydrogen. But at the same time, a full-scale rollout in key sectors like autos, in particularly passenger cars, is, I'm told by the experts, still potentially 2 decades away. And so the world will also need transitional technologies, and South Africa's endowment can support the development of large-scale battery storage capabilities using a range of our minerals as critical inputs into that. For example, vanadium is just one of that. So clearly, I think on these observations that I've made, it's to increase the benefits to the economy. How we respond to climate change should take into account how we can maximize the benefits and reduce the risks and costs. But as with so much, Chairperson, the real challenge is not interpretation of the world, but the how of change. In other words, the implementation plan. And looking at implementation, I would suggest we've got to look at building on successes, think through sequencing issues, sectoral strategies, institutional capacity, and what is the conducive environment that needs to be created. Because these things will need some planning, but they also need an environment in which innovation, entrepreneurship, and the ability of many millions of people across the world doing their own thing, but within that framework can help us achieve our objectives. It can't only be the policies and actions directly of governments, important as those are. So looking at building on our successes, there are many things we're getting right. For example, we have now a renewable energy of solar and wind that is growing, and I'm sure Gwede Mantashe will speak more about this. But much of the technology and know-how is currently imported, in spite of early lead research at South African universities. And we need to leverage from the very size of our procurement, the fact that we're bulking it up and we're saying we're upfront indicating the extent of it, instead of doing these as small parcels. One needs to think through whether that very significant size of procurement can enable technology transfer and know-how transfer agreements that can boost localization and technology development in South Africa. Remember, it's not a once-off technology. These things will constantly evolve and change, and we've got to get in not only as a user of these technologies, but also as a producer of them. Car making is another example. Traditionally, we are Africa's largest car making center. We produce more cars than any other country on the continent. And all of our production historically has been on the internal combustion engine technologies. We've now begun the process of the shift. Mercedes-Benz is now producing some C-Class hybrid vehicles, and Toyota is looking at the Corolla range. We will get the first Toyota hybrid vehicles that will now be on commercial scale coming off our production lines in October, November this year. On consumer goods, I can give you the example of the firm DeFi. They're producing fridges and freezers in KwaZulu-Natal, where it's a solar hybrid product with energy provided both through solar and traditional power grid energy. And it's been launched in South Africa. It lowers a consumer's energy costs by about 40% and can keep food frozen for up to 2 days when there's no power, such as in load shedding. But think about it. It's also a way of using in your refrigeration energy use a greater extent of green energy that you pull directly as a household from the grid. There's a number of projects from the IDC that, if there's time later, I can perhaps elaborate on, that seeks to support battery development and early scale research and taking to market of projects. And there's also now a fuel cell manufacturing facility, a factory that has been opened in Dube Trade Port in KZN that is now producing fuel cells that can be used, among others, on the cell phone masts. And we imported those historically. We're now producing them locally. Perhaps moving off that one, which is really to say we're getting some things right. We need to scale them up, learn some of the lessons, and pull that into policy going forward. Sequencing is important, which means not only getting the right policies in place, but also ensuring that the sequencing favors domestic industrial capacity being developed. So it is managing the demand-supply nexus. Regulatory change, for example, can create demand, but industrial interventions can support the emergence of supply. If you don't get these aligned, you create demand and satisfy it simply through imports, which misses an industrial opportunity, but by the way, also add to the carbon footprint through the transportation of those products. Let me use the example of the path to electric vehicle production in cars. There's a number of different and competing technologies, from a hybrid engine that uses the internal combustion engine to drive the car, but also to generate power that goes into the battery, and the battery then takes over, and the electric part powers the car, to the plug-in one where you drive to a power station, or you at home, you plug it into your electricity supply, to a full electric vehicle that is got a much bigger battery storage capacity, and the holy grail in future, the ones with fuel cell technologies that don't in fact rely on a battery at all. So it may mean that we need technology neutrality, but there's a number of challenges. For example, how do we sequence market opening and local production? If we open up prematurely by giving incentives for the consumption of electric vehicles, so that, say, for example, we remove tariffs and we do things like that, we have all of that provided by global players, not from South African production, and we may, by that very fact, limit the business case for the large OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, to locate in South Africa. So it's getting that balance right that's very, very important. Another example is the sequence of the energy transition and car production. If an electric vehicle is powered with energy that is generated by Eskom through coal technologies, then the carbon emission impact is small. In other words, you don't get the benefits from electric vehicles when they are actually powered ultimately by coal. So we've got to get those kind of things right, and we're looking at that at the sector plan for the auto industry. Which brings me to sector plans. We have a number of master plans that is being developed now, and we can, in each of these, build in green transition provisions in the sector master plans that recognizes that all industries will have to operate differently in future. Yes, we'll also have to identify and prioritize trade export or trade exposed and vulnerable sectors such as steel and energy production and chemicals and cement, among others, and put in place some special measures that can support that transition. Building partnership, and I'm going to go much quicker through my remaining thoughts, Vali, given time. But I would say there that building partnerships first with workers and communities, and that's the whole discussion on just transition. And I'm sure that Becky and Charlie will talk more about that. But we've done quite a bit of thinking in aspects of this in government. But the other one is building partnerships with the private sector and building global partners. There's a particular incentive for other countries to work with South Africa on this and to work with each other on this. But of course, as we build this global partnership, we must recognize that there will always have elements of cooperation and competition. Everybody wants to get a slice of green industrialization. And we need to defend that space for South Africa. On the roadmap, it will require detailed work. We need to not get an absolutely perfect roadmap, but a sufficient roadmap to get the work going. As I've indicated, we're already doing some things where products are rolling off the production line, and build technical capacity and capability, both in the private sector and in government. And that brings me finally to the question, the big question with implementation, in the public sector, and that is agency issues. Who actually does the thing? How do we retool the state to be able to have better capability? And I want to use two examples relating to the IDC before closing with a comment on the IDC, given that one of the commissioners is in fact the COO of the IDC, Joanne Pate. Now, many decades ago, the IDC was a founding shareholder and backer and supporter for Sasol. And through that, the coal to oil technologies developed. They were world-class, world-beating. They still remain an enormous technological innovation that no one has really been able to equal elsewhere in the world. So Sasol has world-beating technologies that was developed in partnership with public entities, in this case, the IDC. Of course, you know, at the time when the technology choice was made, the world had not been as aware of the reality of climate change, and now we need to address that reality. But I wanted to make that point to show how public-private partnerships can work. Let me give a second quick example. And that is in 2011, I mandated the IDC to step up its funding to the renewable energy program. You will recall government had just announced the renewable energy IPP. The financial sector was skeptical. Will government carry this out? Are these things actually going to be stuck with planning, permission refusals, foot dragging, and so on? And so in that context, the first companies to do the bids were stuck. The capital markets were reluctant to come in. So I mandated the IDC to get in there. The IDC got very actively involved. They've got more than 14 billion Rand in 21 renewable energy programs already in place. And what happened was, because the IDC went in, it gave the financial sector the comfort to follow. And today, more and more of the funding is in fact done by private banks and financial institutions. So these two examples show the value of a well thought through strategy and capability in the public sector being brought to bear here, because the IDC could draw on its technical expertise to evaluate the risks of those renewable energy programs and to put a price to that risk in the financing mechanisms that it put in place. So I would see the IDC, I've now already asked the IDC, using the Department of Science and Innovation's roadmap on the hydrogen society, to be the commercialization public entity partner in giving effect to that. And it can play a bigger role. I've pointed to the IDC. There are a number of other public institutions. The CSIR, for example, could be a critical public sector innovator in the green technologies. So you've asked really top of head thoughts and some of the work we're doing, as opposed to the kind of detailed PowerPoints that says, buy this, we'll do this with that resource. I hope this is helpful, Chairperson.